suggested to hold this. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Nick, and the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am going to be talking, as Nick said, about my most recent book, Intact. And about halfway through, I'm going to talk about some things that feature in my forthcoming book, which is about the concepts of freedom and equality. So I'm going to start with some words from Intact. Your body is never good enough. Sometimes you know this because you're told so. You need to lose weight, says your mother, your doctor, a public health campaign. Is your body beach ready? A billboard demands. The question is rhetorical.
Smartphone disconnected.
The only answer that billboard will accept to the question, is your body beach ready, is no, it's not. Sometimes you receive a compliment. I like your hair. Have you lost weight? Now, it's nice to be appreciated, but are these compliments all they seem to be? Why do they leave you feeling worse? Why don't they dispel the feeling that something about you needs to change? Now, distress about our bodies has reached epidemic levels, exacerbated by social media and selfie culture. Our bodies are always under surveillance. They must always be camera ready. Only now the camera always lies. No image is left unfiltered. No photo is left unshopped. The ultimate act of courage is to post with no makeup. So sometimes we change the image, other times we change the body itself. Body modifications, once thought extreme, are now mainstream. Cosmetic surgery reaches more people and sculpts more body parts than ever before. Body modifications, once thought countercultural, are now simply cultural. Piercings and tattoos, for example, are no longer just for goths, punks, and sailors. Last week, my mom got an actual tattoo, tweeted at Joe Moore in 2019. I'm still in shock. Important deets. 1, she's been drunk twice ever. 2, she thinks crap is quite a bad swear word. Apologies if you do too. 3, she got the tattoo on a Women's Institute coach trip to Chester. 4, it's of a ball of wool and knitted needles. And that tweet has been like 32,000 times, and there's a picture of her mum with the tattoo there if you have a look. So, body modifications that were once countercultural are now cultural. Body modifications once thought outlandish no longer cause the back of a westernized eyelid. They seem remarkable, even inevitable. So there's a brisk market in injecting botulinum toxin, an actual poison, into the face. When that was first announced, I think we were all sort of shocked. Now it just seems completely mainstream. Or you could have a vampire facial, which also involves injecting things into your face, but this time it's platelets extracted from your own blood. So surgeries that were once relatively recently unheard of are now again familiar. Labiaplasty, buttock enlargements. In the late 20th century, you wanted small buttocks and no one would mention your labia. In the early 21st century, you want large buttocks and small labia, and everybody is talking about it. Many women will try any exercise, diet, or device that promises to help them, quote, get their body back after pregnancy. So I googled that phrase, get your body back, and I found over 5 billion results. And the first of them, the very first result when I googled that, was a personal trainer offering 13 ways to get your body back after giving birth. I'm just going to read them to you. You might have to take notes. This is applicable. And there's 13 of them. Okay. Number 1, cut out sugar. Number 2, drink lots of water with fresh lemon. Number 3, use a smaller plate. Number 4, slow down. This isn't by sort of sitting down on the sofa and resting with your newborn baby. This is slowing down while you're eating. Eat with chopsticks or scale down the size of your utensils. use a small fork and a teaspoon, for example. 5, no white bread, rice, flour, or pasta. 6, eat soup for dinner for at least 3 nights in a row. I mean, presumably with the teaspoon, but the chopsticks would make it even slower. 7, avoid red meat. 8, eat the rainbow. 9, prepare for eating carrots, celery, peppers, etc. in advance. We're not talking mental preparation here. You don't have to sort of psych yourself up to crudité, right? We're talking chopping and bagging. 10, eat a cup of Cheerios or Chex if you eat a snack. That's quite a surprising one. It's something to gluten. 11, do not sit and eat while watching TV. Number 12, get off your butt, get moving and challenge yourself to break a serious sweat, at least 5 that somehow we find ourselves living in. So when women try to get their bodies back, they're usually aiming for the post-pubescent, pre-pregnancy body. And this is a body that exists for perhaps 10 or 20 years of the average woman's 80 plus years of life. So somehow that minority body becomes not just the ideal body, but the authentic body, the one that most accurately characterizes who you really are inside. So in this narrative, the body must be constantly modified to remain true to itself. But think, why on earth should this particular body, that one in the past, the one that has done much less than you have, be the real you? So in this book, Intact, a defense of the unmodified body, I reclaim the value of the unmodified body. We must insist that our bodies can be good enough just as they are. Now that, I think, is a very simple idea, but it's also a very radical idea. So my argument throughout Intact is that the unmodified body is a political concept. And by a political concept, I mean that the unmodified body isn't only a thing that exists in the world, and a material, flesh and blood existence. It's also an idea that's created by political processes, relations of choice and power, structures of hierarchy and equality, norms of behavior and understanding. And so what the body is and what modification means, these are matters of political significance and also philosophical complexity. Now, this is not to say that there is no such thing as biology. It's not to say that the body has no reality of its own. The body is, of course, a real material thing. It's something that opens possibilities and imposes constraints. We do things through our bodies and we do things to our bodies. We live in them and with them. Fundamentally, we are them. So asserting the significance of the body is central to my argument. But the body is also the site of political meaning. So it's the surface on which we are expected to inscribe our identities, and its appearance gives or denies access to positions of privilege, membership of social groups, indicators of esteem. What we look like, who we are, and how we should be treated are closely related. And the dominant message of many contemporary cultures, particularly westernized capitalist cultures, is your body is not good enough. It needs to be changed so that it truly represents who you are and so that it meets standards of who you should be. So against this pressure to modify, Intact defends the unmodified body as a political principle, and it emphasizes the political significance of resisting pressures to change our bodies. So it's partly a call for individual acts of resistance, but it's much more fundamentally about collective action to disrupt the social norms and structures that demand we change our bodies. So it's a principle that's trying to help us to resist oppression. Okay, now the most obvious objection to my argument so far, I think, will be that body modification is a matter of individual choice. And in one sense, I completely agree with that objection. What we do with our bodies should ultimately be up to us. And so that's fundamentally part of what we need to recognize. But I strongly resist the idea that what we do to our bodies is characteristically the result of our choices. Or rather, I argue that the choices that we make about our bodies are inevitably shaped by social norms, situated within a social context. So our choices must react to the social structures that we navigate, and these are political structures and sources of social power. So my argument then is not ultimately that individuals have a duty to resist modification, or that we do anything morally wrong if we decide to modify our bodies. So my argument is much more modest, but still radical. And it is that the unmodified body, understood in the political sense I lay out in that throughout the book, should be presumed to have value. So the unmodified body then is not an ultimate goal. It's not a mark of perfection. It's not a standard to be measured against. It's not a purity to be preserved, not a badge to be earned. Whether one is permitted to remain unmodified and the stakes of doing so depend fundamentally on where one's body stands in various hierarchies, like your sex and gender, your class and profession, your race and skin colour, your age and weight, your difference and disability. Each of these kinds of bodies are understood as more or less acceptable as they are. So prizes for being unmodified would be prizes for the privileged. So instead, the unmodified body is a premise, a foundation. The unmodified body should be defended as a default. It doesn't have overriding value. Individual bodies should not be judged for their levels of modification, but the principle of the unmodified body, the idea that the body should be good enough just as it is, that idea does have value. And we're in a position where that value needs defending. So we try to change our bodies for reasons that are inexorably cultural and political, meaning that refusing to modify our bodies is a politically significant act. The pressures to modify are so intense that having a completely unmodified body is virtually impossible. We face overwhelming requirements to change our bodies, whether to conceal the realities of aging, to disguise the distinctive features of disability, disfigurement, to perfect our complexion, or our waistline, or our muscle tone, to conform to gendered or racialized standards of beauty, or even just acceptability. And in this context, then, refusing to modify can be an act of rebellion. Okay, so the first obvious objection was about choice, and I'm going to return to that in a moment. But the second obvious objection to my claim that we should value the unmodified body I think, is that some bodies need changing. So some bodies, this objection says, are deficient in some way. Like maybe they are left unhealthy by poor diet or inadequate exercise. Maybe they suffer from pain or disease or disability. Maybe they fail to meet standards of normal functioning. In these cases, so the objection goes, modification is to be recommended. It is an entitlement or possibly a duty. Now, in response to this challenge, which I'm happy to talk about later if anyone would like to go into more detail, I argue in TACT that even notions of health and disability are strongly shaped by politics, by social norms, by social contexts, by structures of power and oppression. So it is true, of course, that some bodies, actually all bodies, have limitations, impose constraints, and fail to flourish. And of course, where we can make our bodies work better for us, we should. But this concept of a better body, or even a healthy body actually, is philosophically complex. What kinds of modifications are understood to be health interventions varies across time and place. For example, one thing I discuss in the book are different attitudes to routine male circumcision, routine secular male circumcision. In the USA, that's regarded as a health intervention. In the UK, it's not regarded as such. And there are also interesting inconsistencies with the way that the British NHS regards measures as being to do with health or not. So another example that I discuss in the book is the contrast between reconstructive breast surgery after mastectomy, which the NHS treats as a health measure and will provide to any woman who requests it, compared with what's called surgery to remove an abdominal apron. If you are overweight and you lose a large amount of weight, you can be left with an overhanging fold of skin in the abdomen, which can cause discomfort, chafing, infected, and so on. The NHS treats removing that flap of skin as a cosmetic procedure and doesn't offer it, even though actually the health benefits of that procedure are quite significant. So even the concepts of health are cultural and political and complex philosophically. And overall, the pressures to modify, and even to health, wildly outweigh the potential for success. So the standards imposed on our bodies cannot be met, because inadequacy is built in, it's built into the concept. So asserting the value of the unmodified body becomes a necessary corrective. Another way of putting this point is to say that the real culprit is not the act of body modification itself, but the virtually overwhelming pressure to modify in the face of an overpowering sense of inadequacy that many of us feel. So in TACT then is an attempt to show that the unmodified body must be understood as something real and something valuable. And in some ways, this is an intuitive position. So we have many ways in which we can express the idea that leaving our bodies as they are, being content with them as they are, even being grateful for them and positive about them, these dispositions can seem attractive and virtuous. We have many ways of expressing this idea. We talk about things like treating our bodies as a temple. We should be as nature made us. We should embrace body positivity. But this intuition will, I think, resonate more with some people than others. So other people will not find that idea of the virtues of the unmodified body appealing at all. They'll see their bodies as a blank canvas, something to be worked on, shaped, sculpted to their own desires, a surface on which to inscribe artwork and creativity. And it's certainly true that not all modifications are problematic. Body modification can be an act of creativity. It can be a rebellion. It can be an expression of individuality, just a source of pleasure. Body modification can bring you health, wealth, happiness. It can also be an act of virtue. Body modification can be an act of sort of caring for ourselves or making an effort. You know, we dress up nicely, put an effort into our appearance to show respect to somebody if we go to an event with us, the wedding, something like this. showing that virtue of making an effort. So generally, again, we should allow people to make choices about things that primarily affect them, like their bodies, even when we try to change or challenge oppressive political conditions that shape desires. But a large amount of modification is not unfettered creativity, nor is it health and happiness affirming. Thank you. It's undertaken from shame, or so as to fit in, or so as to escape discrimination. It's never ending, can never be complete, and will never allow satisfaction. It requires conformity, docility, self-harm, and we do not choose it in a vacuum. We choose it because it makes sense in our cultural context. We are encouraged to do it to feel good. We are required to do it to fit in, subtly and not so subtly. The conditions that shape our choices are laid down by others. But I promised I'd come back to this idea of free choice. And the idea that we should respect free choices, even if we don't ourselves personally endorse them or follow them, is fundamentally an appealing one. So I'm going to think a bit more now about the philosophy of freedom and the philosophy of choice. Okay, now the time available here, I'm going to focus on two kinds of political philosophy which have a focus on choice, that prioritize freedom. Liberalism and feminism. So liberalism and liberal freedom is a property of individuals. For liberals, freedom is not amply secured if it's a property of groups alone. Individuals must always have the freedom to dissent. So freedom can be understood for liberals in either minimal or maximal ways. At the very least, it requires a measure of protection against coercion, and coercion is paradigmatically understood as being something done by the state or other powerful actors. More extensive conceptions of freedom also call for the individual to have resources. These might be intellectual resources or mental capacities of choice, or they might be the means to put desire into action, physical resources. And most liberals prioritize individual choice as being at least necessary for freedom, even if not sufficient. But I think a feminist analysis of freedom has shown that individual choice is not sufficient for freedom. Because as we can see in the case of body modification, people very often do choose to do things that harm them or that disadvantage them. This harm might be social. So, for example, when people choose to engage in practices that reinforce hierarchies and cast them as inferior, a lot of feminist analysis is about that precise question. How do we understand what happens when women choose to engage in practices that seem to reinforce gender hierarchy? Or that disadvantage may be material, as when individuals choose to do things that cause them physical harm or material disadvantage. And why do people choose to undergo risky, dangerous body modification procedures that might leave them injured or have negative side effects? So very often these choices are made in response to social norms. And so it follows, I argue, that relying on individual choice as the measure of freedom will leave those unjust social structures intact, because very often we choose to maintain and participate in those social structures. So a defender of freedom, a defender of autonomy, a defender of equality must be prepared to criticize individuals' choices, even while valuing individual choosers, right? So you need to be able to take draw a line between the individual making a choice and what that person is choosing. So feminism makes this critique of liberal freedom, but feminism also insists on the importance of liberty, as evident in the fact that many feminists saw their goal as women's liberation, right? Liberation being that fundamental concept of freedom. So liberation means freeing women from oppression, subordination, restrictive roles, and violent suppression. Women need to be liberated from the constraints that are imposed by what is variously described by different feminists as gender inequality, male supremacy, patriarchy, or just plain sexism. These constraints are material, they are legal, they are social, and symbolic. So liberalism and feminism, then, they share this commitment to the value of freedom. So what distinguishes them? What makes somebody either liberal or feminist, but not the other? Well, one difference, I think, is a difference in understanding of how freedom is thwarted in actually existing in perfect societies. What is it that prevents us, collectively and individually, from enjoying the freedom to which both liberals and feminists agree we are entitled? Well, liberals have typically placed the answer to that question in the state. The thing that stops us being free is the state. So for liberals, we need to defend forms of government or legislative change that can enhance our freedom and with it our equality. So liberals will defend institutions such as democracy, the separation of powers, written constitutions, bills of rights, all these things that limit the power of the state. And they will also defend measures that the state can take to protect freedom. So, for example, law against discrimination, and the creation of a welfare state to provide basic resources for everyone to enable them to follow plans of life, an economy that includes both market freedoms and a measure of redistribution. Feminists typically observe that such instruments, even if necessary for liberation and equality, have not been sufficient. The feminists note that freedom and equality, as understood in liberalism, are gendered, and that liberal institutions have played out differently for women and for men. So women as a group systematically have fared worse than men as a group, even in those times and places characterised by shared commitment to liberalism. So there's a gap there. So what this means, feminists point out, is that liberal theory and practice hasn't secured freedom and equality for women, and what's more, many liberal regimes or liberal philosophers have either not noticed or not cared about that persistence of gender inequality. So that deficiency looks, from a feminist perspective, like a deficiency in liberal theory and practice. So in my own work going prior to Intact, and going forwards, I've tried to identify where liberalism goes wrong from a feminist perspective, and to consider whether liberalism should be abandoned in favour of feminism, or whether there should be a liberal feminism or a feminist liberalism that combines those two insights. So in my first book, which was called Sex, Culture and Justice, Limits of Choice, I argued that one way liberalism goes wrong is by treating choice, this idea of free choice, as what I call a normative transformer. Okay, so normative transformer is something that transforms the normative characteristic of an act. So it's something that changes a situation from unjust to just, or from wrong to right. So consent is one example of a normative transformer. Many acts that are unjust or wrong, if they are committed non-consensually, become acceptable or just if consent is present. That's a kind of fundamental claim of liberalism. So consent, turns rape into sex, it turns theft into gift giving, it transforms the normative character of the act. And consent is also very closely related to choice. And in the context of body modification, consent and choice are what prevents surgery, tattoos, and medical treatment from being instances of criminal assault or bodily harm. When the surgeon places their scalpel into your skin, that's not an act of criminal bodily harm because you consented, if you consented. So what's wrong then with treating choice as a normative transformer, as liberalism does? These examples are absolutely plausible. Surely a commitment to liberty also requires allowing people to bear the consequences of their free choices. So, we should allow people to make choices, we shouldn't prevent them from doing so, and if those choices harm them in some way, That is part of what it is to give that individual freedom to take responsibility for the consequences. Well, to an extent, that's right, that liberal picture is correct. But what I think feminists are keenly aware of, and liberals tend to ignore, is that we don't make choices in a vacuum. We choose within our context. So our choices are affected by social construction, which is to say by the need to fit in with or respond to the context we are in. Okay, well, what do I mean by social construction? Well, I'm going to suggest that our choices are socially constructed in two main ways. So firstly, we can only choose from the options that are available to us. And the set of options that is available to us depends on that social context. So, we can't choose to be opera singers if our society doesn't have the art form of opera. We can't choose to have buttock implants if that particular cosmetic surgery hasn't been invented yet or is unknown in our society. A very simple sense in which our choices are socially dependent. And moreover, the options that are available to us in our society are often pre-sorted into those that are marked as appropriate for us and those that are not. So to go to those two examples, in the UK, opera is a cultural form that is typically codified as being connected to the upper middle classes. And if you are not a member of the upper middle classes, if you're a member of somebody with a working class background, typically you may not have experienced opera as an art form that is appropriate for you to participate in or watch, and so you're less likely to choose to do so. Or to think about cosmetic procedures, and these are fundamentally sorted into the kinds of things that are appropriate for people like us to do and not for others, along lines of gender, perhaps most obviously, but also race, also class and profession. So, makeup, for example, is culturally understood according to dominant norms as something that is both appropriate for women, possibly even required of women in certain contexts, whereas it's coded as something that's inappropriate for men. And so it's unsurprising that most people who use makeup are women, and most women use makeup in some form, and the opposite for men. So these choices may be free in the literal sense of being uncoerced, and they can also be genuine in the sense of being identified with and endorsed. But they are socially constructed nonetheless. The second way that choices are socially constructed is through our preferences. But generally, we all want to be accepted and praised by others. We want to feel that we have a place in our society. Sometimes we want to stand out as the exemplars, but I think most often we actually want to fit in. So over time, as part of our inherently social nature as human beings, we tend to take pleasure from doing those things which are socially expected of us. So fashion is a good example here, right? When fashions change, initially the new fashion might seem jarring, strange. What is this new shape of jeans you're supposed to wear? What are these new kinds of clothes? And we might initially, when there's a new fashion coming in, conform because we feel we have to kind of meet the expectations of others rather than follow our own tastes. But before long, generally, that new aesthetic becomes our own, and we actually like what we're wearing. Now, depending on how fashionable you are, the lights are very bright, so I can't see no judgment here. For some of us, we might look back on clothes we wore last season, or last year, or last decade, right, and think, what was I wearing? That, it's so strange. So what we want to wear shifts in response to that social acceptability. So when a context is highly gendered, as all liberal societies are, it's not surprising that women and men make different choices. And certain choices are cast as appropriate for women and not men, and vice versa. So women and men consequently form different preferences. So part of this gendered construction of choice is an incentive or a mechanism by which we all are vulnerable to making choices that harm us along some dimension. And this is something that all of us can do, regardless of our gender. But again, we see gendered patterns in our behaviour and the kinds of choices that men are encouraged to make and the kinds of choices that women are encouraged to make tend to have different impacts on our well-being, our equality, and our position in society. But I'm not making a false consciousness argument here. Choices to conform can very often be rational, right, within a gendered system that rewards us for making gendered choices or punishes us for non-conformity. So it's not that we're making some mistake when we choose to conform, but we have false consciousness. We might be fully painfully aware of the injustice of various kinds of social norms, including gendered norms, and yet still correctly assess that it'd be better off if we conform to it. So the problem isn't that people are making bad choices or foolish choices. The problem is that we are choosing within a context of injustice. All right, for my closing remarks, I'm going to go back to the unmodified body. I keep seeing it. Okay, now there's a really great song which I recommend you all look up on YouTube when you leave here, by a singer called Rachel Lark and her group The Damaged Goods. And this song is called I Want to Lose 5 Pounds. Really do look up on YouTube, it's excellent. I'll read you a little bit from the lyrics, I won't sing it. All the other women should love their bodies, but I want to lose 5 pounds. I'm not talking anything crazy, I just want to shed some belly fat and slim down. I'm doing this for me, and I'm proud to say self-love is making me feel this way. I need healthy habits, and I really should eat more veggies and be more good. I'm aware that our society tricks healthy women into dieting. That's not what this thing's about. See, I just want to look cuter when I'm going out. So all the other women should love their bodies, but I want to lose 5 pounds. Now that is a kind of satirical comment on the body positivity movement, which I've mentioned before. I'm just going to reflect on that in these closing remarks. So the body positivity movement urges us to reject this constant feeling of dissatisfaction and anxiety in favour of loving ourselves, seeing ourselves as beautiful regardless of how our bodies are. And you notice that I argued that we should think that our bodies are good enough just as they are. I didn't argue that we should think of them as being fantastic or wonderful just as they are. Why so modest? Now, it's definitely a good thing to love your body. I'm not wanting to suggest that anybody shouldn't. But the body positivity movement, I think, suggests that really what we have here is a problem of individual self-esteem. That it might be up to us individually to choose to be beautiful, to choose to feel good about ourselves. And in doing so, I think it risks obscuring the political and economic structures that set us up to feel bad, privatises a political problem, and actually offers us another way to fail. Right? Because now you can feel bad about your body, but you can also feel bad about failing to love your body. Now, the body positivity movement is not bad, not at all. I'm not wanting to say it's a bad thing. Deliberate measures to cultivate good body image can work to an extent, but the body positivity movement does have problems. It has been used, ironically, by some major beauty brands. Most prominent among them is Dove. You've probably all seen body positivity adverts from Dove, which describes itself as the home of real beauty. And Dove has really commandeered the use of body positivity as a marketing tool. Now, some of its work is evidence-based, and it's formed with really respected experts on body image. So the Dove Self-Esteem Project, for example, goes into schools and does some really good work helping with young people. But I think some of Dove's forays into body positivity actually perpetuate the problem they try to solve. Now, here's one example. In 2015, it's quite a while ago now, but Dove ran a Choose Beautiful campaign in 5 cities around the world, and you can still watch this again on YouTube. So large signs that read either beautiful or average were placed above the entrance to major public buildings like train stations or shopping centres or whatever. So anybody entering into the building has to choose, Do you go into the door with beautiful or the door with average? And Dove released a video showing women making these choices and discussing them afterwards to camera. So, I went through the average door, says one woman. Really? Says her friend. Yeah, I didn't even hesitate, first replying. Another woman on the video describes her decision straight to camera. Every day I go through the average door, but yesterday was a unique day, so I chose to go through the beautiful one. And she was elated. Several parts of the video show women pushing each other through the beautiful door. Right, that very clear, you should be beautiful. There's a mother pushing her daughter, and there's another woman literally pushing a woman in a wheelchair through the beautiful door. And the video closes with women and girls triumphantly going through the beautiful door and the hashtag choose beautiful. Now, this video is meant as a celebration of individuality, of body positivity, the choice to call oneself beautiful. But I think in reality, it replicates the same old tropes. All the people depicted making the choice are women. There are no men forced to make this choice that are on the video. None of them are fat. Despite this supposedly empowering aim, this choice between beautiful and average forces women to rank themselves against each other. Right? You should not just be like other women, you should be beautiful. But of course, not everyone can be beautiful if beautiful means not average. It's completely nonsensical. And this nonsensical choice replicates the beauty ideal. Every woman should be beautiful. That's the message of the video. But universal beauty is impossible because beauty means not average. If every woman is beautiful, they're just the same thing. Now, my favorite part of this video passes without any kind of commentary or explanation. It's a woman, she arrives outside the building. She looks at the signs. She frowns and she turns and she walks away. So in Intact, I show that the precious modified can be overwhelming. They reflect and reinforce structures of domination and oppression. They undermine the basic equality that we should all share. And my aim is not to demonize modification. All of us have little choice but to modify our bodies in some way or other. And the precious modifier the more our bodies are deemed inferior. There's no justification for ranking bodies on the basis of how unmodified they are or manage to be. But instead, I'm trying to show the political role of the precious modified and the urgent need for collective action to resist. The choice is important, but choice is not everything. We do not choose our social context. We do not choose how gender is understood and enforced. We do not choose the content of the beauty ideal. We do not choose to be on the receiving end of a barrage of images of the perfect, in scare quotes, the perfect body. We don't choose the judgment, the appraisal, the comments on our appearance, and the assumptions made about our identity. We don't choose to live in a world where we are constantly receiving the message that how we look is one of, if not the most important thing about us. So we live in a society that is becoming ever more visual, ever more focused on how we look. Our appearance becomes a measure of our value. Our bodies become an indication of our character. There's no flaw from something that cannot be fixed. No limit to the project of self-improvement. No body that is good enough. But I'm going to argue, I have argued, that it's time to say stop. It's time to allow our bodies to be good enough. And it's time to recognize that when virtually everybody feels bad about their bodies are not the problem. So it's time to reclaim the value of the unmodified body. Let our bodies, ourselves, be whole, intact. Thank you.
To pass it down, I'll just move the microphone over so people can still hear us on Zoom as well. We do want to say have a bit of time for questions or responses. So if you already have a question, do pop your hand up and I will come down with a microphone. Robin, I don't think you have a microphone there, do you? Just got to. So I'll come down and find you. Yeah, you can't take this one right now because I'm talking. But, thank you. And do I see some questions? We've got one there. So we've got one here, and then one there, and then one there. And I really encourage you to ask questions, otherwise you have to listen to my questions, which won't be as good. So come to the microphone. Robin.
It's very interesting what you said. These are about worldwide epidemic of obesity and how the body has a different is often sought to give women who are in this position the feeling that it's okay when we know that it has a lot of health implications and it's an international health problem. There are these seemingly irreconcilable aspects to it, that it's a health emergency, if you like, and people should be encouraged to take action about that. But I take the point about the context of the politics of soon being pedal. So on. I wonder how you Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I alluded to this halfway through, but I talk about it in much more detail in the book. So this is this subject as there are various ways in which we ought to change our bodies, and obesity being one example. Now that I think is something that is a very powerful feeling. Lots of people will say to me, well, there's changing your body because of how it looks and changing it for health when they're completely different. Firstly, I don't think they're completely different. I think often we don't really have a very clear access even to our own motivations and feelings about when we're worried about health, when we're worried about appearance, when we're worried about identity. They all get wound in very closely. But of course it is the case that different bodies and ways of being in a body affect our health differently. But obesity is a very, very complex phenomenon, and one in which a great many of the public health measures are not evidence-based. And are very surprising, actually, when you do some of the evidence-based work, which I personally don't do, but I have read some of the research on this, to find that most of the public health measures that we have used to combat obesity just actually don't work at all, and sometimes really counterproductive. So a really interesting example here is the idea that we should have calories on restaurant menus, right? So the aim of these kinds of campaigns are usually to reduce BMI. And of course, we can have a debate about whether BMI is a measure of health, but let's just set that aside. These measures have not been effective in reducing BMI at the population level. And the evidence shows that when you have something like calorie counts on menus, maybe there's an initial reaction, maybe you make a different choice maybe once, but generally, we eat the food that is available because it's what's on the menu, what we're used to eating, and so on. So our calorie consumption doesn't significantly change. What does change is that we feel bad about ourselves, and that disordered eating for others is potentially worsened. So then the other piece of really important, I think, research from the evidence base here is that it doesn't work to make people feel ashamed about themselves as a way of reducing obesity. People don't lose weight if they feel bad about their bodies or if they're told that they should lose weight. We are all constantly bombarded with messages about fatness being bad and how we should be a certain size and not above a certain size. No fat person needs to be told that obesity is bad because they didn't know. Right? They get that message all the time. And in fact, feeling shame about one's body is actually much more associated with finding it harder to change. People who feel good about themselves tend to find it easier to make change. So there's some philosophical questions about the concept of health. There's also sort of empirical medical questions about whether the extent to which obesity, fatness, and health are correlated, none of which is sort of my expertise, but I've read a bit about. But what does seem absolutely clear is that what we're doing now and the idea that you're constantly shaming people for their weight is not an effective public health measure. Yeah,
Falling
wobbly
apart.
somewhere.
There we go. Yes, we had a lady with glasses.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. A few things stuck out, jumped out at me. It seems to me there's a lot of marketing targeted at people maybe to make changes, but also you mentioned self-esteem. And it just seems to me that a lot of the marketing is targeted at people perhaps who are vulnerable and who want to change, and they're peddling sort of a quick fix or a way to improve your self-esteem. You'll be so much happier when you have and they're in a very vulnerable part of their life because they've never done this before. Everyone seems to be doing it. Maternity clothes. It's think in your talk.
It's about shame in the book, and in relation to this question, inducing shame in people is the sort of core function of a lot of marketing. Or do you think it's a bit more salvageable than that?
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much in that question, and I think it's absolutely right, isn't it, that the ways and moments of vulnerability that are overlaid with marketing are so profound. I mean, one of the things that I think is worth saying is that the research does show that virtually all of us feel this sort of shame. So there's a very, very large, tens of thousands of adult people surveyed recently, which had absolutely shocking findings. So this survey showed that 70% of women feel immediate pressure to have a perfect body, right? Not just a nice body, but a perfect body, 70%. And you might think, well, okay, that's sort of shocking, but not particularly surprising. But another statistic from that same survey that I think many people find surprising is that 2/3 of men feel ashamed of their body. And that concept of shame is, as you say, very much in the book. And I talk about the concept of shame maintenance, all the things we do to maintain the idea that our bodies are shameful, whether it's concealing them, not talking about them in a deprecating way, keeping things private and unsayable. And so shame becomes a really important part of it. I also wanted to pick up on something that you said about the marketing. And what I think is really significant here is that we need to try and keep separate two things that are generally often merged together, which is the idea that our bodies could be different, and the idea that if our bodies were different, we would feel different. Not just in our bodies, but mentally, we would feel happier, more successful, have better self-esteem. And this is something that is really clear with a lot of beauty procedures, particularly cosmetic surgery. I talk about it in the book in that context. So, if you go to see a cosmetic surgeon, I've lots of conversations with cosmetic surgeons, which I recount in the book. And I've given lectures to cosmetic surgeons as well. So I've had lots of conversations with cosmetic surgeons. So if you go and see a cosmetic surgeon and you say, I would like to have breast implants or nose job, facelift, whatever it is, the surgeon will have a pretty good idea of whether he or she can in fact create that body part looking differently, right? The surgeon knows what is within their capability and capability of the procedure to change. What the cosmetic surgeon does not have access to, because there's very, very little long-term research on this, is how you will feel once that has been done to you in a long term. There tend to be short-term follow-up studies, but nothing medium or long-term. And of course, when people go to cosmetic surgeons to seek cosmetic procedures, they tend to imagine that having this different body part will make them feel better. And we tend to merge those two together. And there's very little evidence for that. I mean, one of the people that I quote in the book is a psychologist of appearance, Nicola Ramsey. He says, she puts it this way, she says, people don't tend to graduate from low body confidence or from appearance anxiety, right? The body part isn't really the thing, it's the anxiety is there all the time. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of marketing is about creating that, either explicitly preying on anxiety in a kind of quite explicit way. There are lots of examples of adverts that prey on, are people looking at you? Can people see this about you? What do other people see when you look at your body? Even just an advert that tells you that people are doing something to their body, makes you think that maybe you should be. You're kind enough to quote my appearance in the Observer beauty column. I told you this just beforehand. I told my family, oh, I was in the Observer beauty column. And my 14-year-old son said, why are you in the beauty column? Right there by enacting. I said, because of my beauty, of course. And he said, oh, because you're Brooke, wasn't it? Yeah. But the thing in the Observer beauty column was about, which I didn't write, so it's the beauty editor who wrote about eyelash serum, right? This new thing that apparently we're all supposed to be putting some serum on our eyelashes, right? And so just the existence of this product makes you think, are my eyelashes, I don't know, moisturised enough? I'm not sure what it's supposed to be. But anyway, all these products create the need and create the anxiety. Sorry, I wasn't meaning to make you feel bad about your eyelashes.
Thank you. I think we have one question over here. Yes, from the gentleman with the glasses. Oh, it's been done. So the lady in the blue at the back.
Hi, thanks, Claire. That was a lovely talk, actually. But I have a few questions to take it back to when we're very little. Is it universal? I don't know. That all of us, or children in general, start observing the differences between us and want to change themselves. They change something about themselves, And then fast forward, we are in a world where we're very comfortable. A manifestation of the fact that we are in a luxurious kind of part of the world where we don't have to go and hunt and get food or do. Is that a manifestation that came out of that? And then there are the commercialization of everything. So for us to be successful, we're going to go and create a business or go in a place where you're going to make money. So this eyelash serum, that's exactly what castor oil does, and it's been doing since the ancient Egyptians, for example. Don't quote me on that, but it's based on evidence that I've had from friends at the time. So I remember having a friend, so there are two examples here. Went to university, had a friend who had serious image. I think there's a name for it. It's actually a medical problem, and that that she carried, she just didn't feel that about herself. The other question I have, the management of this luxury that we have. My current friend, psychologist, very went the other way. Actually, she told him she wants to be able to wear clothes, put in the clothes. So I wonder whether this body modification could be because we can't fit in the majority of the clothes that are available for us. Retail, when we go and buy things, if there were clothes that would fit every single body that was available, and the haute couture was not for the people who can afford it, I wonder if we would need to go and seek that body modification. Just like what you said about Dove, that's the last point, sorry. For them to push that and use it as a marketing, as the lady was saying, it's not particularly just for the greater good. It has to sell, it has to make money. So I feel like it's all a really complicated kind of points that leads to that.
So the role of history and commerce in shaping this over the years. Any observations?
Thank you so much. I've just jotted down a few notes on what you said. So you started with the question of children. Do all children notice difference? Yes, there is a normal developmental stage around the age of 6 or 7, when children first sort of really notice themselves as different from others. and this again is something that psychologists and parents who told me this. So it's very normal for children around 6 or 7 to suddenly announce that they don't like something about their body or themselves. And it will just simply be this normal stage of noticing that they are different. So it might be their hair color. I don't like my hair color. Everyone else has different hair. It might be their height. It might be their race. And one of somebody I was talking to about this said that his child was mixed race, and it was around this age that she started to say she wished she looked more like one of her parents than the other because that would fit in with her friends. So there's this normal developmental stage around 6, 7, which children go through, and that can make us feel as parents or people talking to children, that they are expressing, as it were, some deep dissatisfaction with their body that we ought to try to fix, whereas actually it would be something no matter what it was for that particular child. And that again, I think, is something that is a lesson that comes back from that quote I gave to the last question about, we don't graduate from appearance anxiety. Appearance anxiety is sort of baked into our culture, such that it's not really. I'll speak loudly and as it comes back. It's not really about anymore.
Thank you.
What are
Get battery.
not really anymore about what our bodies sort of look like. Just the mere fact of anxiety is its own reward. I mean, one way I think of this sometimes. I'm not going to do this, so don't worry. But if I pointed to somebody randomly in the audience and I say, what would you like to change about your body? I think most people would have an answer that they would be able to come to. But let's say that's not the case, and I point to you and I say, what do you want to change about your body? And the person I point to says, actually nothing. I feel perfect just as I am. But my sense is that the rest of us just sort of think, does that person think they are? They're so perfect. Like we sort of want people to feel bad about their bodies. It's not seen as being appropriate for someone to say, everything about me is perfect just as it is. So we sort of bake that anxiety in as an expectation. The clothes and what fits, yes, absolutely. There's this sort of feedback loop between, you gave the example of clothing, so whether clothing fits your body is about what kinds of clothes are made, and whether clothes are made for bodies or bodies made for clothes, and what's expected to change. And this general sort of cycle of marketing is again something you see with cosmetic procedures such as surgery, but also the various procedures that have developed. As new procedures are invented and marketed, new parts of our bodies suddenly become things we think about whether they're good enough. Right, like the buttock enlargement example that I gave, or the eyelash serum. Right? We never thought about those things until there was a procedure we were supposed to be doing to make them a certain way, and then we realised that our own body parts are not appropriate. So there's definitely that cycle between what sells and what we feel, and there's a real marketing in change.
Thank you. I'm going to have to be slightly more athletic now with the one microphone.
Oh, yeah.
We might be able to get some replacement batteries. I think, Robin, they do often have some around. Okay. Radio and remote control. So you were first.
We're in an era, as you've been pointing out, of real lookism and body modification and so on. And it wasn't always this way. Say in the 50s, I think it was more cerebral age, perhaps. I wasn't around, but maybe. And I just wonder if you think that the pendulum will sort of swing back and people won't be so obsessed with body image anymore, and maybe other things will preoccupy us.
Will your campaign succeed?
Oh, predicting the future is never something I like to do. I have to say I don't feel particularly optimistic about that, right? I mean, you look, on the one hand, you might say development of technology, looking forward could be an assistance here. So one of the examples I mentioned in the book is, if you're on Zoom now, you can wear Zoom lipstick. Right, you've tried this? It's quite funny. But like Zoom makeup on, so it's not real makeup. So you're like, the technology can do all these things for us. I don't have to make my actual lips look a certain way. I can just press the button. But of course, that's doing nothing at all to reinforce the idea that I ought to look like I look when I've got Zoom lipstick on. It's huge development of apps that modify and filter and change the face. Many people, particularly young people, when they're posting selfies, will always use a filter, always use an app that modifies the face and the appearance of it to quite a significant extent. Again, cosmetic surgeons report people going to see them with their face as modified by an app and saying, you know, make me look like I look on the app. So I'm afraid to say I don't feel enormously optimistic by them looking forward will it will be changed, but obviously what I hope is that we change. And I think that the first step for me, I mean, look, this is a philosophy talk, I'm a philosopher, so I do think that there's a huge amount of power in thinking and talking and sort of bringing to mind these sorts of things and trying to point out, as I do in the book, the huge breadth of ways in which we make the body feel bad. So it's not just about beauty, which I've been talking about a lot today, but in the book I talk a lot about things like disability and the ways that we think the disabled body is, you know, should be viewed as deficient or as shameful. I talk about I mentioned bodybuilding and the male body and how masculinity is tied in with the body. I talk about health and surgery, this real broad variety. It's about hair and makeup, racialized conceptions of appearance, and so on. So I think it's a hugely broad phenomenon. Trying to draw connections between all these phenomena, I think, is sort of philosophically interesting and perhaps can form a way of seeing some resistance. But I wouldn't want to go so far as to say I predict it will be fine in the future. Let's hope so.
Thank you. Robin, have you got the microphone working? Yes. We have 2 questions at the back, and then you can come in with yours, Robin, if you do as well.
Thank you very much. As you can hear, English is not my first language. I might not express myself perfectly, but the continuation of actually it isn't for
I could hear you.
okay.
Yeah.
To me, it doesn't that things will change hugely. I mean, it did change a little bit. I was quite happy to see in the billboards a little bit oversized ladies a couple of years ago compared to skinny 13-year-old girls advertising ladies swimwear, etc. But I mean, capitalism is about creating and making people want it, isn't it? I mean, we live in a world where everything we purchase, everything we do is kind of created. It's not natural in a sense. So what is your recommendation? I would add.
Thank you. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. Philosophers don't like saying what you should do, but I don't mind it. I'm happy to hear you. Okay, so there's various things that I think we can do, and that some things are being done and that are sure to work. You mentioned diverse images of people with diverse bodies. Like that's one of the things that really does make a difference. So a visual diet that is more diverse than the standard one where everybody in it has to be of a certain age, gender, race, body size, disability status, and so on. So more diverse images of people, different body shapes and types is something that makes a real difference. Interestingly, I mentioned already sort of evidence-based intervention. One thing that the research has shown is not particularly effective is having some kind of kite mark or symbol or logo on a photograph that shows whether or not it's been photoshopped. Right? So some people have advocated that as a method, but the research suggests it doesn't actually work, because if you look at an image that is a standard beautiful image which has a little logo saying this has been photoshopped, it doesn't make you think any differently that this is an ideal to be emulated. Right? I mean, think about like Disney princesses. Right? We all know those are animated; they're not real women. And yet, millions of girls and women want to look like Disney princesses, right? So the fact that something is put up as an ideal of beauty is the issue. And so that diverse range of people that we see, whether as models or just, in in advertising, on TV and so on, makes a big difference. There are things we can do with legislation. It's not all about legislation, but there are things we can do with legislation. So there are ways in which the Advertising Standards Authority has started to understand body image anxiety, body image sort of instilling that body image anxiety as being something that advertisers should have a real eye to, and that it has been able to be active against some adverts that have more egregious versions of sort of shaming of bodies. Similarly, there's some legislation that was passed very recently which makes Botox and fillers illegal for children under the age of 18 unless under the care of multidisciplinary health teams. There are some cases where it's appropriate, but mostly not. So there are ways we can do that. Thinking about our children, I think also is very difficult and interesting. I think there are, when we're thinking about our children and how they are constantly bombarded with negative body image messaging, we sort of need to talk to our children about it, but also not talk about it too much. It's a kind of difficult balance. So on the one hand, I think reassuring children, particularly teenage girls, but not only, that it's normal to feel bad about your body in the sense of common, right? And that feeling bad about your body is something that is deliberately cultivated by a whole host of advertisers and media. And that is something to sort of be on the lookout for and to recognize as being a widespread phenomenon. Like talking to young people about that, I think is really helpful to make them feel reassured that when they feel bad about their bodies, that's because there are very, very powerful interests in capitalist interests keeping them that way. But also to try not to talk to our children too much about their bodies in the sense of telling them they should be better, or they should look different, or they do look beautiful, or they do look wonderful, just to try to let people's bodies just be a thing in the world that is there rather than constantly confident. That's some ideas, but there's some more in the book, but I don't want to talk too long.
Thank you very much. And we have one at the back, Robin, as well. Do we have another one? Yeah, great.
I was just interested in your thoughts on to what extent inequalities in healthcare, particularly gender inequalities, exacerbated the images or the issues around body shame and the idea that body positivity is a rebellion against such ideas. Do you think that has exacerbated these elements of society these days, or would they have been like that without the inequalities that we know exist already?
Thank you. I've got lots to say. Can I just ask you what kind of inequalities specifically you're thinking of?
So around kind of the knowledge and understanding of variations in healthcare and medical knowledge. Gender, I think, is probably a big one, but there's often inequalities in it that come from race as well, around whether or not that lack of knowledge is causing the treatments to be overtly aimed towards people's bodies being the failure behind them. So the idea that a lot of the treatments for women are often you need to lose weight and then we'll see if some other treatment will work. That's your primary response from doctors often. Does that come from a lack of knowledge, or does that come from other societal forces that say that women should be that way particularly, or a certain race should face that issue more than any others?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, you allude to lots of issues that are really sort of important and profound in this space. I mean, three things have come to mind. One is absolutely, before you said it, I was thinking it's exactly this phenomenon where for many people who are deemed overweight or fat, then if they go to the doctor about anything, the answer will be lose weight, right? And that's not a very helpful answer. Firstly, because again, just being told to lose weight is not normally the problem. It's not that people don't think they should or aren't trying. It's, being told is not necessarily what's stopping that from happening. But also, even if losing weight will be a significant health benefit to that person, at the moment they go to the doctor, they haven't lost weight, and so they need assistance for their health problem then and there. And losing weight can't always be the panacea. So that's an absolute example of the ways in which our standards about sort of fatness and body size tend to take over. I mean, the comedian and fat activist Sophie Hagen puts it in a way that I quote in the book, which I think is really sort of profound and really struck me. She says something like, chances are you were taught to hate fatness long before you knew what you liked. And that really sort of struck a chord with me. I think for many of us, ideas about body shape and what body shapes are acceptable are really, really deep. And lots of people, lots of women who might feel they're relatively unaffected by norms about hair and makeup or whatever, will feel profoundly struck with sort of feelings of shame about weight and fatness. And so I think fatness is a huge part of this. You mentioned women and knowledge about women's health. Yeah, Caroline Criado Perez is great on this. You read her book, yeah, Invisible Women. I would recommend that to everybody who hasn't read it. I see you have. About the ways in which we often just don't dedicate medical research and knowledge and time to thinking about issues that affect particular groups, of women being her example. And you also mentioned race, and again, we have seen COVID was one example, but also huge racial differences in maternity treatment and outcomes for women of colour in maternity care, where we are simply not providing medical care and healthcare in anything like an equitable way. And not all of these things have to do with, as it were, the demand for body modification, but they all have to do with the way that our bodies are placed in hierarchies and valued or not valued depending on levels of conformity. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have one more question, two questions at the front. We're running out of time, so if you can keep them fairly brief, we should be able to get through. That's all right. That's what you're here for.
Okay.
And then behind you, straight afterwards.
I'm sure you've read your I used to know but basically one of the things that she discussed why listen to her more is that dieting isn't the thing, calories are not the thing. It's nothing to do with why you get fat or why you're anorexic and body image and eating disorders are not necessarily because you actually look. She talked about, doesn't she, how young women usually them as they're growing up, but the adult and very conscious and that kind of thing. But it seems spread the word about that, but it's nothing to do food and do something else, which is instead of eating, you go for a walk, you read a book, you have sex, you go meet some friends, instead of thinking about food. And those issues were really, really, I mean, you could see that in a lot of you. It was the beginning of that, and those ideas never really got quoted, did they? And you've been saying is obviously the other thing I wanted to comment on, that you don't talk about sexual attraction. A lot of the reasons that people are interested in having the perfect body, and the men too the same, is because of sexual attraction. I don't think you're going to get away from that, because there's always going to be an issue about people wanting to be desirable, and obviously personality and interest in the person is very important, but you can't matter. So they again some of these things don't actually help change your nose or your boss, your bust, whatever it is, not necessarily going to help.
We're great on this time. Do you want to take one more
I
question?
just want to say how good it is that you mentioned the fact that the same issue is not coming up with men, and these awful podcasts that men have got to look a certain way now, and they've got to do certain things. anyway, I think I really think everything you said was really interesting. I don't.
Great to have your thoughts. I want to take the question behind you as well, and then we'll ask Claire to respond to both.
Mine's less of a question, I think less of a question, more of an observation. I became disabled 13 years ago, and obviously some of my disabilities are very visible, and it's really fascinating to see how other people's perceptions of me have changed considerably. And you almost have to develop a thick skin and educate them, or sort of make allowances for other people's awkwardness about disabilities. But also over the last 13 years, I put on about 4.5 stone, mostly on my stomach. And that has affected my own self-image of myself far more than my disabilities have, which I find on the one hand quite fascinating. On the other hand, it's also to do with practicalities of finding clothes fit. But in a wider context, all of these sort of prehistorical carvings that we see of women always have a sort of protruding stomach and in motherhood, whereas now it's very much, like you said, the pre-motherhood stage of our lives, and particularly the pre-pubescent female image that reigns supreme. And I find the whole thing really fascinating. But personally, I'd love to be able to lose lots and lots of weight, but every time I go to the doctors, they make me feel really lazy, and very much is my problem.
Thank you. Well, a lot to talk about there, Claire. We've got a couple of minutes if you want to finish this off.
Yeah, well, I'll respond to the last one first. So, at the doctors, I think that is fits in with what I think you will be in any way alone in that, whether it's from the GP or from others around you. And you know, one thing I said to you is that often people will have a personal story that they will share with me about these issues, and what I've learned is that everyone has their own personal experiences about their body in some way, and that's partly what I'm trying to draw attention to. On the question of disability and perceptions, yeah, I mean, I talk about this when I talk about the work of James Partridge, who very sadly died a couple of years ago, but he was the founder of the charity Changing Faces, which is people with visible facial difference. And part of his life, he was also a friend of mine, was campaign on behalf of those with very notable visible facial difference. And he talks precisely about that. He says there is a point at which you have to, as a reaction to you. And he talks about how he had a very obvious facial, he called it a facial disfigurement or facial difference. When people first see him, they would tend, start or stare or something because he did look so unusual. But it only takes a few moments conversation before that disappears and you're talking to the person. So I think that's, again, going back to the previous answer about diverse images of diverse bodies. The more we see diverse bodies, then the less they startle, and the more we see the people that they are. On the first questioner's comments, so much about this. Susie Orbach, yes, I talk about her in the book, and she's got a more recent book out, Bodies, which came out just as I was finishing mine. So I don't engage with that, but we have different areas of issue. But yes, I talk a lot about her work. Did feminists take it up? Well, I think there is someone coming back to it. I think that my book is partly doing that, but the question of the role of the body in feminism, I think, is coming back, and the question of when the body stands into something else. Exactly, but is it actually about food? Is it about fat? Is it about the body? Is it about something different? And you mentioned sexual attraction as being the thing that it's about. Sometimes, yes, it is about sexual attraction. Although the bodies that are found sexually attractive, again, vary over time. Trends come up and down. One of the issues I mentioned in the book is something like the current standard for women under about 30 that you should to be just that's the normal thing that you would do, whereas for women above about 30, 35, that would not have been a normal practice. So there are these, changes in expectations of sexual attractiveness. And finally on men, the first chapter of the book is all about bodybuilding and male bodybuilding, and that's a fascinating place to start, if I can say so myself, because bodybuilding as a sport and as an activity is all about sculpting a beautiful male body, but it's absolutely not about sexual attractiveness. And the norm that you're trying to create with bodybuilding is to have a body that other men want to have, right? Not that men or women want to have sex with. That's not the idea. It's about what do you want to be like. And so there's always this question: do we want our bodies to be bodies that other people want to, enjoy sexually, or that they would like to have themselves? Who are our bodies for? It's not always sexual attractiveness. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. Can we let Robin ask one quick question? You're waiting so patiently.
I'm very quick as I can. I work with obese and morbidly obese patients in terms of giving them hip and knee replacements. Yeah. And I'm interested in this concept of body image and the anxiety, because the next logical step is denial. And I'm just wondering how much you've encountered that in your studies. And we never confront people in the clinic. We say, your wound's not going to heal, you're going to get diabetes, you're going to get blood pressure, you're going to have a heart attack, you're going to have a stroke. Yeah? So that's the way we take. We don't talk about the body image as such. But what happens is there's a catharsis usually. And they come out and say, oh, yes, I am fat. Yes, I am. Maybe I should look in the mirror a bit more, okay? No, we don't. We're not talking about appearances here. We're talking about blood pressure, wound healing, diabetes, etc., etc. But one thing I've learned about your experience is that not to get in there until you've actually got proper psychologists and proper bariatric services. So my question is, denial, that's the logical extension of body anxiety. Yeah? What do you think? Is that a real phenomenon?
Denial by the patient.
Denial, that they just don't want to look in the mirror. They don't want to. They just buy bigger and bigger clothes, and they just get into a system of denial.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you say denial, I mean, the way you describe it, it seems very much like what I talk about as shame. Shame. Yeah, it's the idea that our body should be sort of unstable or shameful, and there are various ways in which we make our bodies shameful. Some of them are very sort of explicit and obvious. So I talk about menstrual shame, the idea that women should conceal periods, and it would be very shameful if any woman were visibly bleeding or leaking. That's a very standard form of shame that we attach to bodies. But it can take all different kinds of form. One man that I spoke to said to me, what shamelessness is for me is that I never take my shirt off at the beach, right? And that's what I think when you say that. I think many of us have bits of us that we look at or think. So when you say denial, I don't think of it as if we're all going about blindly unaware that we have imperfect bodies. I think of it very much as we're extremely aware of ways in which our bodies fail to meet standards. We perhaps don't want to always confront it, but we know it's there.
The trouble with talking about a knee, for example, and the risk of knee replacement is that you have to face up to it. So that becomes a very difficult.
Yeah, so then the question is, what are the evidence-based ways of helping people with things like obesity or whatever the issue might be? And that's a really difficult one. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Clare. And thanks so much for such a fantastic range of questions. Successful evenings when I don't have to ask any questions.
Oh, yes, you have that.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. Can we just one more time thank Clare for a fantastic talk? We do have one more talk this season on freedom and identity, and we have Shaprak Khorsandi. You might have heard of her on the radio as Shapi Khorsandi, and she's talking about culture, identity, and humour. We are what we laugh about. And she'll be talking about, obviously, her experience of humour, freedom, cultural identity. It should be a fun, evening, and that's on the 13th of June, so second Tuesday in June. Please do sign up for our mailing list. It's osoarts.org.uk/philosophy club, and I will gently remind you a couple of times that these talks are taking place if you do that. Thanks so much to everyone for coming on, and I hope you enjoy it. Yeah.